I wasn't supposed to raise a child alone. When I married Hugh Dunley, I believed in the kind of forever people stitched into quilts. We didn't have much, just a small rented house on the edge of Cedar Hollow, Iowa. But we had plans. He was kind, soft-spoken, the kind of man who made ordinary days feel safe. Then came the diagnosis, and by the time Leora was 4, I was a widow with a daughter who still asked when Daddy was coming home. I didn't have time to grieve properly. Bills came before tears. I took the first job I could get waitressing at Ruby's Diner, and then a second cleaning the county office after hours. Some nights I came home too tired to eat, but I always left a note in her lunchbox. "You're my sunshine. Love you always, Mom." I memorized her class schedule so I could call on my 10-minute break and hear her voice. I made Halloween costumes out of thrift store curtains. I skipped lunch so I could buy her ballet shoes when she was 8. People in town used to say, "Callista, you're stronger than most." And I'd smile and nod. But inside, I wasn't proud. I was just surviving. My love for Leora wasn't a choice. It was the marrow of me. I wanted her to have a childhood she'd never have to recover from. Every report card I hung on the fridge felt like a little victory. Every scraped knee I bandaged made me feel like I was still holding the line. By the time she hit high school, Leora was shining in ways I never had. Sharp mind, sharper ambition. She talked about colleges I'd only ever seen in movies. I told her she could go anywhere, and I meant it. I took on extra shifts, started driving to the next town to clean offices for better pay. She got into Stanford. The day the acceptance letter came, I cried behind the steering wheel of my car for 20 straight minutes. Happy tears, I told myself. Only happy tears. I packed her bags carefully that fall, folding each piece of clothing like it mattered. I left a small envelope tucked inside her laptop case. Inside was every dollar I could spare, and a note. "Make something beautiful of your life. You already are." I watched the bus pull away from the depot. That morning, her face turned toward the window, but not waving. Maybe she didn't see me. Maybe she did. Either way, I stood there for a long time after the taillights disappeared. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time she truly looked back. The first time I noticed it, I told myself I was imagining things. It was a phone call. During her sophomore year, shorter than usual, her voice clipped, distracted. She said, "Mom," the way a stranger might, soft and pre-youngter. I asked how her classes were going, whether she was eating well, if she needed anything. She answered in half sentences, then mumbled something about a study group, and hung up before I could say I loved her. At first, I thought it was just the demands of college life. I remembered being her age. Well, not really. At her age, I was already raising her. But I remembered how the world could stretch wide and full of promise. I didn't want to be one more obligation on her growing list. I gave her space. When I visited campus for Parents' Weekend during her junior year, she looked surprised to see me. Not unhappy, just startled, like I'd shown up without warning, even though I'd called twice, to confirm. She introduced me to her roommates as my mom from Iowa, as if that explained everything. I offered to take her to dinner. She suggested a place across town, less crowded, she said. But it felt more like a place where she wouldn't run into anyone she knew. She started softening her vowels, dropping the Midwest from her speech. I smiled and said nothing. She'd grown into such a polished, poised young woman. Everything I'd worked for, really, but I started to feel like I'd been left behind somewhere in the scaffolding of her success. After graduation, she moved to New York for a job with a marketing firm, then met Simon at a networking gala. He came from old money. His father ran a private equity firm. His mother sat on 3 non-profit boards. Leora called to tell me they were engaged. Her voice was bright, rehearsed. I congratulated her and asked if she needed help planning. She said she had a coordinator. I asked about the guest list. She said they were keeping it small. I flew out anyway, sat near the back. Her dress was exquisite. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a magazine. I stood in the receiving line, waiting for her to turn my way. When she finally did, her smile was the same one she gave to strangers, offering compliments in passing. A few months later, she and Simon bought a home in a gated community in Connecticut. She texted me a picture of the front porch, white columns, climbing ivy, a black Labrador in the yard. I typed out a message 3 times before finally settling on, "Beautiful, I'm proud of you." Her reply came 6 hours later. Just a heart. I still believed the warmth would return. I didn't know the cold had only just begun. The layoff came on a Thursday morning wrapped in careful corporate language and a folder of next steps. After 18 years at the same department store, they were restructuring. I nodded, accepted the envelope, and packed my locker in silence. I didn't cry. Not there. The drive home was long, though it was only 10 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and when I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a while, staring at the cracked porch steps. My rent was due in 3 weeks. I had just enough in savings to get through 2 months maybe if I stretched every dollar. There was no pension, no fallback, just me. I applied for jobs. I polished an old resume. I even went to a job fair at the local community center and stood in a line with people half my age, all holding the same nervous hope. But no one was hiring women nearing 60, with retail on their shoulders and no degree to prop them up. At night, I warmed cans of soup and left the television on for background noise. I told myself I had options. I still had Leora. I hadn't visited in almost a year. We usually settled for brief texts and holiday cards, but one Friday morning, after another rejection email, I packed a small overnight bag, tucked my pride deep down into my chest, and took the early train to Connecticut. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want her to talk me out of it. Her neighborhood was as pristine as I remembered. White fences, trimmed hedges, not a leaf out of place. I rang the bell and waited. When she opened the door, she blinked in surprise. Her eyes darted to the overnight bag, then back to my face. She didn't smile. "Mom, is everything okay?" I stepped inside. I lost my job. "Honey, I've been trying to find something else, but it's been hard. I was wondering if I could stay for a little while, just until I find my footing again. I'll be out of the way, I promise." She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter knuckles, pale. Then she sighed sharp and shallow. "You've always been so strong, Mom. I think it's better for both of us if you keep being that way." Before I could respond, Simon appeared in the hallway. He looked at me like I'd wandered in off the street. "Is something going on?" he asked. "My mother needs a place to stay," Leora said evenly, but I told her it's not a good time. Simon nodded slowly, then disappeared into the other room. I felt the words forming something half between a plea and a scream, but none of them made it out. I nodded instead once. I picked up my bag. "It won't be a problem," I said, and walked out the door without looking back. I slept in my car that night, parked behind a closed gas station 2 towns over. The seat wouldn't recline all the way, and the cold slipped through the windows, no matter how many layers I wore. Still, I felt strangely calm. Not at peace exactly, just empty, like the part of me that had always waited for Leora to see me to really see me had finally gone quiet. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't call again. I wouldn't send birthday cards or holiday texts. I wouldn't try to prove I was still worth something. If I wasn't welcome in her world as I was then, I had no place in it at all. What Leora never knew, and maybe never cared to ask, was that I'd spent the last 15 years listening more carefully than anyone expected. Back when I cleaned offices at night, there was a janitor named Ron. Kind man. He had a quiet wisdom that lingered after his sentences ended. We'd talk during our breaks, me eating my cold dinner out of a Tupperware, him leaning against his mop like it held more than water. One evening, he told me about a piece of land he bought outside of town for $800. Said it was ugly and overlooked, just like he'd felt most of his life. 10 years later, they built a warehouse on it, and he sold it for 6 figures. He gave me advice without fanfare. Buy what no one else wants and hold it like it matters. So I started small. A vacant lot near the river, a foreclosed home with a leaky roof. I fixed what I could, rented when I couldn't sell, reinvested slowly. I never told Leora. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't want our relationship colored by a number. I wanted to be loved for who I'd been to her, not for what I might leave behind. By the time I left that gas station parking lot, I wasn't just jobless. I was done waiting. I used a portion of the money to close my accounts, sell what I owned, and change my name on the lease I'd soon sign in another state. I didn't need an audience for my disappearance. I only needed distance, and for the first time in a long while, I had the means to create it. I arrived in Asheville with a new phone number, a new address, and a name that still tasted like mine, though it felt different in my mouth. Callista Dunley, the same woman maybe, but finally living for herself. I rented a small apartment above a quiet bookstore just off the town square. The ceilings were low, the floors creaked, and I loved it the moment I stepped inside. I didn't need much. I'd lived with less for years, but I wanted to build something that felt alive. So I opened a flower shop in a narrow space with big windows that caught the morning light. I called it Blue Thread after the tiny wildflowers that used to grow behind our house in Cedar Hollow. The ones Leora picked for me when she was 5, tied together with a rubber band, proudly calling it a grown-up bouquet. Customers came slowly at first, then steadily. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, even divorces. Whatever someone needed to mark with something soft and blooming. The shop gave me routine, but it was the women's shelter down the street that gave me purpose. I started by dropping off leftover bouquets, then stayed to help fold linens, organize supplies, or just listen. Some of their stories scraped against my old wounds. Others reminded me that survival doesn't always come with a thank you. One morning, a reporter showed up at the shelter asking about anonymous donations. Someone had told him about the gift cards, the rent paid in full for 3 women, the envelopes that arrived with no return address. I didn't want the attention, but when the article ran, it named me anyway. The quiet benefactor, the headline read. I folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer. That week, Maeve came into the shop for the first time. She owned the cafe next door and brought scones wrapped in wax paper. Her husband had passed 4 years earlier, and she knew the language of solitude. We didn't talk much at first. She sat at the counter while I arranged lilies, and I sat at hers while she stirred coffee. We traded silence like it was something sacred. Over time, she became the closest thing I had to kin. She never asked about my past, but she truly saw me not as someone broken or saintly, but as a woman who had chosen to begin again. It had taken nearly 60 years, but for the first time I was building a life that didn't orbit someone else's needs. A life that was mine, even in its quietness. And then one day Maeve walked into the shop, holding a folded newspaper, her face pale, her voice low. You might want to see this. It started like any other morning. Leora was scrolling through news alerts with one hand stirring her tea with the other half listening, as Simon discussed something about a client dinner that evening. Then her thumb stopped. A headline caught her eye. Anonymous donor funds $500K grant for single mothers in North Carolina. Below it, a still from a local TV segment, a photo of a woman standing in front of a flower shop, arms folded loosely, a soft smile on her face. It was me. She didn't move for a full minute, just stared. Her breath went shallow. She tapped the video, watched as a reporter spoke over clips of the shelter and testimonials from women I had helped. Then my name appeared on the screen, Callista Dunley. The way I used to sign her field trip permission slips, the same name I'd been born with, and the one I chose to keep now that I was no longer anyone's burden. Leora called immediately. The line buzzed once, then announced the number was no longer in service. She tried again, then again. Nothing. She opened her laptop, searched for the flower shop Blue Thread. There it was, nestled on a narrow street in Asheville. 5 stars, dozens of glowing reviews. She sent an email to the contact listed on the website. It bounced back. She opened her own inbox and looked at our last message over a year ago. She had replied with a heart emoji to one of my birthday greetings. Nothing more. By evening, she had booked a flight. The next morning, she stood in front of the shop, just as I had once stood in front of hers. The windows were warm with light, and the faint smell of eucalyptus drifted through the door as someone walked out carrying a small bouquet. Inside, a young woman stood behind the register. Leora stepped forward, her voice tight. I need to speak with Callista. I'm her daughter, the woman blinked. I'm sorry, ma'am. Miss Dunley doesn't take walk-ins. I flew here. I just want to talk to her. Leora said, her voice rising. Please just tell her I'm here. The clerk hesitated, picked up the phone, spoke quietly into the receiver. Leora waited, hands clasped in front of her chest like a prayer. After a long moment, the clerk set the phone down gently and looked at her with careful eyes. "Miss Dunley appreciates your visit," she said, "but she's not available." Laura didn't respond. She just stood there motionless. As the clerk turned back to her screen, the bouquet orders resumed, and the door behind the shop remained closed. The clerk reappeared just as Leora turned to leave, her hand trembling slightly as she held out a small cream envelope. "She asked me to give you this," she said quietly. Leora took it, nodded, and walked out without a word. She didn't open it until she was back in her hotel room, sitting on the edge of the neatly made bed, the afternoon sun stretching across the carpet like a spotlight. Her fingers hesitated at the flap. When she finally broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside, her breath caught before she read a single word. "Leora, I waited for you to see me. Not the version you approved of. Not the image that fit neatly into a photo frame or a guest list. I waited for you to see the woman who raised you in darkness without asking for thanks, who stayed up through fevers, scraped together rent, and loved you so thoroughly that she forgot to love herself. The day you looked at me and saw inconvenience instead of family, something broke. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hate. It was the quiet crumbling of hope. I kept telling myself that love could be enough to fix it, but the silence that followed told me what words never did. I'm not writing this to punish you. I'm writing to close the door gently. I wish you a good life. I hope it's full and meaningful, but I won't live in waiting anymore. I found peace in places where I am seen for who I am not, who I was required to be. Take care of yourself." Mom Leora read it twice, then again. By the third time, her hands were shaking. She pressed the letter to her chest and wept soundless and hunched, the kind of grief that doesn't ask for permission. She reached for her phone, dialed Simon. It went to voicemail. She left no message. The light in the room dimmed as evening settled. She didn't turn on the lamps. She sat in the dark, with her mother's words still echoing in the space her presence had once filled. When sleep finally came, it was thin and fractured. The next morning, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then into her purse. She wasn't sure where to go, but something told her she hadn't yet reached the end. The invitation came by email from a women's leadership group in Asheville. They had read about the shelter donations, heard about the quiet florist who never took credit. They asked if I would be willing to speak. I nearly declined, but Maeve convinced me otherwise. Sometimes, she said, you don't speak for yourself. You speak for the woman sitting in the back, still waiting for permission. The room was small, no cameras at first, just folding chairs, soft lighting, and people who had grown tired of pretending they weren't tired. I stood behind the podium, hands steady, heart surprisingly still. I told them about silence, not just the kind that falls when no one calls, but the kind that settles in when you begin to disappear in the eyes of someone you once fed, clothed, protected. I told them about love that gives without asking for return, and what it feels like to finally say enough. I didn't speak about money. I didn't mention the real estate, the grants, or the articles. I spoke of something rarer, the courage to walk away from someone you love when they've shown you again and again that they no longer see you. The speech was recorded by a volunteer. The clip found its way online, shared quietly, then widely. One night, Maeve brought over her tablet and showed me the view count, hundreds of thousands. I closed the screen. Leora found it too. She watched the entire speech alone, her laptop balanced on the marble countertop in that kitchen I had never seen. Her hands curled around a cold mug of tea she'd forgotten to drink. She didn't look away once. Not when I said the word daughter. Not when I paused too long between sentences. Not when my voice broke slightly at the end. She sent a message that night. Just one line. I'm sorry. I see you now. I read it when it came through. I sat with it, let it settle, but I didn't reply. I had nothing cruel to say, only silence, the kind that speaks not out of punishment, but out of peace. And somewhere I imagined her walking back into her spotless kitchen, placing her phone on the counter and realizing it would not light up